He thought she was asking for shelter, but the Apache widow came to buy back her horses. Ely Mercer saw the woman at his gate before sunrise and assumed she had come to ask for shelter. But before he could speak, she lifted the small cloth bundle already waiting in her hand and said she had come for her horses, not his roof. The words landed before the morning had fully formed, sharp enough to break expectation at once, and Ely stopped halfway down the porch steps because nothing in her posture matched pleading. She stood too steadily for that. Shawl pulled close against the cold payment cloth held ready, as if she had rehearsed refusal before dawn even arrived. Everyone in town believed Apache widows came only when loss forced them near ranch fences, except this one, who had arrived prepared to bargain. When he asked which horses she meant, she answered without hesitation. 3 sold during winter debt, 1 gray mare, 1 bay gelding, 1 dark mare, all from her husband's line before illness took him, and the calm precision in her voice made it immediately clear she had not crossed distance to test rumor. Ely knew exactly which animals she meant, because he had purchased them through 2 hands and 1 hurried document months earlier, never expecting unfinished truth to arrive standing at his own gate before dawn. He told her plainly that sold horses did not usually return because someone carried silver late, and she opened the cloth without argument, revealing coins wrapped beside a strip of beadwork. Not enough for market price, but enough to show she had not come empty. Then, from the lower pen, the gray mare lifted its head sharply and stamped once before either of them moved, as if the animal had recognized something before the rancher allowed himself to. Nita Taza turned slightly at the sound, but did not smile, because memory was not proof yet. And Ely noticed that restraint more than anything else, the refusal to turn emotion into persuasion. Before he could answer, hoofbeats sounded from the road behind her, 2 riders slowing when they saw who stood at his porch, and one of them laughed lightly that sunrise had become trading hour for old debts now. Ely did not answer the rider. He looked instead at the silver, then at the widow, whose hand had not lowered once since speaking, and understood that whatever answer came next would not remain private, because frontier mornings rarely allowed a man to separate fairness from witnesses. When the rider added that old papers settled old questions, Nita spoke before Ely did, saying paper did not raise those horses, and the silence that followed was sharp enough that even the rider's grin weakened, because the statement carried no anger, only fact. And Ely realized in that moment that what stood at his gate was not a request for mercy, but a rightful claim delivered with enough dignity to make refusal feel heavier than usual. The riders did not leave immediately after her words, because men who expect weakness often linger when dignity interrupts them, and Ely noticed the first rider lean farther in the saddle, as though trying to decide whether the moment deserved mockery or caution. Nita kept her eyes on the lower pen instead of the road, because she understood that looking toward laughter only feeds it. And when Ely finally stepped down from the porch with the silver still unopened in his hand, the gray mare lifted its head again and gave a short, restless pull against the rail before he reached the fence. That movement changed the air more than conversation had, because even the riders saw it. The horse was not reacting to Ely, but to the woman standing 3 paces behind him. Ely asked which one she would name first if the gate opened, and Nita answered the gray mare without hesitation, describing the scar beneath its left shoulder where winter wire had cut skin years earlier, then adding that it stamped twice before drinking if unfamiliar hands stood too close. One rider gave a short smile and said half the territory could invent stories once a horse lifted its head, then suggested she should be grateful the rancher had listened at all, because town buyers rarely reopened bargains for widows who arrived with cloth instead of contracts. Ely still did not answer. He unlatched the outer rail only enough to step near the mare while keeping the inner gate closed, and the animal shifted hard toward Nita, neck forward, ears alert, then struck the ground once in exactly the rhythm she had described. The rider's smile faded first. Nita did not move closer, because proof arriving without invitation carried more weight, and she named the bay gelding next, saying its right ear bent slightly inward after a rope accident the summer before her husband died. Eli looked across the pen and saw the detail exactly where she said it would be. The second rider, less amused now, muttered that town paper still held stronger memory than grief, then asked whether Eli intended to let old stories undo legal purchase before breakfast. Nita answered that unfinished debt was not old story, only delayed truth, and this time even Eli felt the line settle differently because she was not defending herself. She was correcting the frame entirely. He finally opened the cloth and counted the coins slowly, knowing they fell short. Yet what unsettled him was not the amount, but the fact that she had chosen exactness instead of appeal. He told her quietly that silver alone would not decide anything today, and one rider laughed again, saying the rancher was wise to remember that horses worth keeping should not return because someone arrived before sunrise, speaking carefully. Eli turned toward the pen and said nothing until the gray mare pressed its head once against the rail nearest Nita's side, and only then did he answer that some horses remembered better than men. The words landed heavier than he intended, because the riders exchanged a look that recognized something shifting, and Nita understood that the negotiation had moved past simple refusal. The town had now witnessed the animals themselves refusing to behave like property stripped clean of memory. Eli stood at the pen longer than necessary after the riders finally moved off, the wrapped silver still in his hand and the inner gate still closed. And that silence unsettled Nita more than refusal would have, because men usually answered quickly when they intended to deny something. The gray mare remained near the rail, breathing steadily toward her. Yet Eli did not unlatch the gate, not immediately, and the extra pause stretched the moment into uncertainty, sharp enough that even the nearest ranch hand stopped stacking feed to watch. Nita waited without pressing, because bargaining loses force the moment patience becomes pleading. But inside she understood that the next few breaths mattered more than the silver she had brought. Eli looked from the mare to the bay gelding, then toward the road where town dust still lingered faintly, and for the first time since dawn he appeared less certain, as though fairness and consequence had finally met in the same place. He asked how long she had raised them, not as courtesy but as if the answer might decide whether the latch moved at all, and she told him the gray mare had been born during late snow, that her husband slept beside the stable fire 2 nights because the foal could not stand, and that the bay gelding learned to turn only when called in Apache before it ever followed rope. Eli listened without expression, but still the gate stayed shut 1 beat longer than comfort allowed, and Nita understood he was measuring not memory, but what opening that latch might cost once town voices returned by daylight. Only after that hesitation did he finally lift the latch halfway and then stop again, telling her there would be one condition if she wanted all 3 horses returned. She would stay through the week and prove the animals still answered to her better than to his own men. The condition came with enough delay that for a moment she thought refusal might still follow it, and that uncertainty sharpened the choice immediately, because staying on a ranch this close to town meant becoming visible in ways she had avoided since widowhood. She asked whether the week was for him or for those already riding back to town, and Eli answered after another short pause that horses convinced him quickly. People took longer. Only then did he open the gate fully. Nita stepped inside with controlled calm, but her pulse tightened when the gray mare crossed the space without rope and lowered its head against her shoulder before she touched the mane, because proof arriving so easily could change more than ownership. Even the ranch hand near the feed shed muttered under his breath when the bay gelding turned at her first-hand signal, circling once without lead, and Eli understood immediately that the week he had named might now serve less to test claim than to force witnesses to accept what they would rather dismiss. Yet, as dusk began lowering across the field, a wagon appeared at the far road, carrying a folded document held high by the driver before he even reached the fence, and Eli knew before the wheels stopped the town had chosen to answer proof with paper. Before the wagon reached the fence, Nita noticed movement on the road behind it. 2 figures near the far bend, slowing just enough to watch without approaching, and that distant stillness told her the document in the driver's hand mattered before a word was spoken. Eli saw them too, and understood immediately that town had decided not merely to comment, but to formalize discomfort, because paper often arrived when spoken pressure failed. The driver climbed down, holding the folded sheet carefully, as though the object itself carried authority, and offered no greeting before extending it toward Eli with the explanation that a buyer from town had submitted written notice claiming prior interest in the 3 horses should any transfer occur again. Nita remained near the pen gate, one hand still resting lightly on the gray mare's neck, and the horse's calm beside her made the paper feel colder than it likely was. Eli unfolded the sheet slowly and read enough to see names he expected. The grain merchant, the trader, 1 witness from town, men who preferred signatures because signatures looked cleaner than interference. The driver added that the buyer wished Eli to understand there were consequences if livestock already entered market sequence and then reversed under private sympathy, and though the tone stayed polite, the wording made the intention plain. Fairness was being recast as bad business. Nita watched Eli's face rather than the paper, because she had already learned that frontier documents rarely arrived to defend widows, and when he did not answer at once, she understood that the silence now belonged not to uncertainty about horses, but to the weight of what town had chosen to send in daylight. One of the distant watchers near the road shifted slightly, enough to confirm that witnesses had come not for the horses, but for his reaction. Eli folded the document once more, handed it back to the driver, and asked whether written notice also included written memory of unfinished debt, because if paper had become the language of fairness, then perhaps town should decide which truths deserved ink. The driver hesitated, clearly unprepared for answer rather than irritation, and before he could recover, the gray mare moved suddenly forward, pressing shoulder first against the open gate as if impatient with delay, forcing Nita to steady the rein with one hand. That movement pulled every eye toward the pen, and did more than argument could, because the horse crossed directly to her side the instant space opened, ignoring Eli's ranch hand standing closer. Even the driver looked toward the animal before speaking again, and in that moment Nita realized the town had brought paper, expecting hesitation, yet proof kept arriving from the pen itself. Eli finally said the week would continue exactly as agreed, that written notices did not outrank witnessed truth, and the driver took back the paper with visible reluctance before returning to the wagon. As the wheels turned away, the 2 distant watchers on the road disappeared with it, and Eli understood the document had not ended anything. It had only announced the town would now try to move the bargain through other hands before the week finished. The merchant returned after dark exactly as Eli expected, but this time he came without pretense, riding straight to the porch with a leather case in one hand and the certainty of a man who believed numbers solved what principle complicated. Nita saw the lantern light catch the case before she heard his voice, and understood immediately that town had stopped sending opinions and started sending price. Eli remained on the porch while the merchant opened the case and laid counted bills across the rail, then named the amount plainly. 3 times what Eli had originally paid for the horses, cash before morning, if the widow left before sunrise, and the transfer ended quietly. The precision of the figure changed the moment at once, because exact money feels more dangerous than vague persuasion, and Nita felt a brief, sharp fear she had not allowed herself earlier. Not fear of insult, but fear that a number large enough to matter might finally outweigh what had seemed steady all day. She did not look at Eli immediately, because the silence between an offer and an answer often reveals more than words. Yet inside she understood how winters had taught ranchers to respect certain sums even when they disliked who offered them. The merchant added that town buyers were willing to settle this cleanly before sentiment made business look foolish, and that no one would blame Eli for correcting a gesture that had already attracted too much attention. Only then did Nita lift her eyes and see Eli studying the money without touching it, not because temptation ruled him, but because he wanted the merchant to understand he had considered the full weight before refusing. That pause lasted long enough for her fear to sharpen once more, because hesitation always leaves room for loss, and she tightened her hand unconsciously around the bead strip tied beneath her shawl, the same way she had held herself at his gate before dawn. The merchant noticed the gesture and turned slightly toward her, saying the horses were already priced beyond widow silver now, and that memory became expensive when towns decided to compete for it. Nita answered nothing, because she understood the merchant wanted visible desperation to strengthen his side, and she would not give him that satisfaction. Eli finally reached for the wrapped silver she had first placed on his porch and set it directly beside the merchant's larger sum, the small cloth looking almost absurd against the bills, then said calmly that unfinished bargains were not measured by whichever pile looked heavier after sunset. The merchant's expression hardened because exact refusal after exact price leaves no softer path, and Eli added that if 3 times the payment had become possible overnight, perhaps town had finally admitted the horses were worth more than paper first claimed. For the first time since arriving, the merchant lost the polished calm and asked whether Eli intended to let frontier trade be ruled by sentiment. Eli answered that sentiment had never walked onto his porch carrying exact silver before sunrise and naming scars on 3 horses by memory. When the merchant gathered the bills back into the case and rode off without farewell, Nita exhaled only after the hoofbeats faded, because she understood that for one brief moment the horses had nearly become numbers again, and that Eli had seen her fear even though she had never spoken it. The next morning no one arrived with papers or offers, which unsettled Eli more than either had, because towns rarely fell quiet after money failed unless someone had chosen a different method. By mid-morning the answer appeared. One of the town buyers came through the lower gate without waiting to be invited. Boots already dusty from the road, and confidence sharpened by the kind of entitlement that mistakes open land for permission. Nita was in the pen brushing the dark mare when she saw him step inside the fence line, and before Eli crossed from the barn, the man announced that if the horses truly belonged to her memory, they should answer under challenge, as well as comfort. He reached for the gray mare's lead rope without asking, perhaps expecting the animal to yield, simply because men usually believed control proved ownership better than history did. Nita did not move immediately, because she understood that sudden protest would only make the moment look emotional, yet every muscle in her body tightened when the mare lifted its head sharply at the stranger's touch. The man pulled once, firm and impatient, but instead of following, the mare planted its front legs and jerked backward hard enough that the rope slid through his hand. He tried again, irritation replacing confidence, and this time the horse turned sideways, ears pinned, refusing even the first step, while the bay gelding struck the ground behind her. Eli had nearly reached the fence by then, but he stopped short because the scene had already begun proving itself without intervention. The buyer muttered that stubbornness meant little, grabbed the rope lower and tried to drag the mare forward. But the moment Nita spoke one quiet word in Apache, the horse shifted instantly, not toward the buyer, but directly toward her, crossing cleanly to her side and lowering its head as if rejecting the challenge itself. The sudden contrast silenced the yard. Even the ranch hand near the trough gave a short breath of disbelief because the movement was too immediate to dismiss. The buyer looked toward Eli as though expecting him to rescue authority from embarrassment, but Eli only asked why town men had begun entering fenced pens to test claims already witnessed twice. The buyer tried to recover by saying trade required certainty, yet certainty had already betrayed him. The rope still hung loose in his hand, while the mare stood calm beside Nita without restraint. Nita then led the horse one full circle, using only hand motion, stopped it, and touched the old scar beneath its shoulder exactly where she had described on the first morning. Eli saw the buyer's expression shift from irritation to something closer to reluctant defeat, because public failure lands hardest when no one argues around it. The man finally dropped the rope and stepped back through the gate without apology, but before leaving he warned that town might stop arguing now and start remembering differently later. Eli watched him ride off, then looked toward Nita and told her quietly that by evening the horses would leave with her, because after today, even town pride would struggle to invent another reason to delay. Yet neither of them said aloud that leaving had already become the hardest part. By late afternoon, the ranch had grown unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a struggle ends, but before anyone decides what peace should look like. And Eli understood that town had withdrawn, not because its pride had softened, but because too many people had now seen proof with their own eyes to keep arguing without exposing motive. He brought the corrected papers from the house just before sunset and placed them on the porch rail beside the reins. Nita had repaired herself during the day, then opened the lower pen and led the gray mare out first, followed by the bay gelding and dark mare, each animal moving with calm familiarity, as though the week had already chosen its own ending before either of them had spoken it aloud. Nita stepped forward slowly, but before taking the reins, she reached beneath her shawl and touched the small bead strip tied beside the old leather loop her husband had once stitched onto her saddle years earlier, a gesture so brief that no one else might have noticed. Yet Eli understood immediately that she was measuring not only what had been recovered, but what memory required before release became possible. She rested her hand on the gray mare's neck, then on the saddle leather, and for a moment the yard held only that silence, past and present meeting without hurry. Eli told her the papers would prevent any trader from challenging her road south now, and that by morning no one in town would legally stand between her and whatever place she chose next. She looked at the horses, then at the road beyond the gate, and finally at the ranch itself, because the answer she had been carrying since dawn no longer belonged only to direction. When she asked what if she no longer intended to ride south, Eli did not respond immediately. He had spent too many years alone to mistake important words for impulse. She explained that she had come only to reclaim what winter had taken, but during the days since sunrise, she had found something she had not expected to ask for. Space where dignity had not needed defense every hour, work offered without pity, and silence that did not feel like exclusion. Eli leaned one hand against the porch rail and answered that the ranch had room for 3 horses, room for work, and room for anyone who chose it freely, but none of it would ever require gratitude dressed as obligation. That line mattered because it gave her exactly what she had feared losing elsewhere: choice, untouched by debt. She looked once more at the bead strip in her hand, then tied it carefully to the saddle horn of the gray mare, instead of returning it beneath her shawl, as if placing memory where it could ride forward rather than remain hidden. The next morning, when town people saw the Apache widow riding beside Eli Mercer toward the western pasture instead of toward the southern road, with her 3 horses moving behind them across open ground, the story settled into something no paper could revise. She had come to buy back what was hers, and stayed because for the first time since loss, the future before her did not ask her to become smaller than herself in order to belong. She came before sunrise with silver in her hand, but what she wanted back was worth far more than money. Would you have returned the horses? If this story stayed with you, like the video, share it with someone who values quiet strength, and subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for more frontier stories of love, dignity, and survival.